Hello and welcome to Brazil's Solar Journey webinar, brought to you by BIREC, Brazil's International Renewable Energy Congress, which will be taking place this October in Rio de Janeiro. In the past year alone, Brazil's installed solar capacity has increased tenfold to 237 megawatts. Approximately 60% of Brazil's installed solar capacity is made up of distributed generation projects, with over 12,000 projects connected to the grid under the country's net metering scheme and a target of 1.2 million PV systems by 2024. 2017 looks to be the year of utility-scale solar in Brazil, with the first of these projects having been connected to the national grid in June, and another 510 megawatts is due to begin construction by the end of the year. Brazil's solar sector may be required to contend with impacts of the recently announced power sector regulatory reform. However, the announcement of
the broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Including solar resource to take place in December this year, forecasting continued growth for Brazil's solar sector. In today's webinar, we will be discussing Brazil's solar journey, looking at the country's development of residential, commercial, and industrial scale and utility scale solar projects. Today, we are joined by Pablo Otten, the Vice President of Emerging Markets of 8-Minute Energy. Pablo has developed over 2 gigawatts of renewable energy projects in Latin America, the EU, the US, and Asia, and pioneered development of solar PV projects in several of these markets. 8-Minute Energy is the largest independent solar PV developer in the US, with over 1.5 gigawatts under contract, and operations in Brazil, Mexico, India, and Bangladesh. Also with us today is Eduardo Serra, the Chief Executive Officer of Energia Capital. Energia Capital owns over 600 megawatts of solar projects, including 435 megawatts in the final stage of development. Welcome, both of you. So the format of today's webinar will be as follows. Each panelist will give a short presentation, after which we'll open up for discussion. Please do get involved by sending your questions and comments to us via the question message board in the bottom of your screen. We'll end with each speaker giving his closing remarks. Don't worry if you miss any of the discussion today. We'll be recording the webinar and we'll send a copy out to you afterwards. If everyone is ready, Pablo, please would you like to start off with your presentation?
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. Just waiting here for the presentation to show up. Okay, here we go. Again, good morning, everyone. I'm working for 8-Minute Energy, where, as is mentioned, we're the largest developer in North America, independently held, and we have operations in multiple countries, including Brazil. As you can see from the first slide, what we do is solar PV utility scale, and our mandate is relatively narrow. We do only utility scale, and we only do projects 50 plus megawatts. So we find Brazil, as we get into the matter, extremely attractive because it's going to become one of the key and leading markets in the utility scale segment. I'm going to go through and flip through the presentation relatively quickly, and I'll open for questions right after. Apologies, it's a little bit of delay in passing through the presentations. So here I will start with our mandate, which is to make solar energy abundant and basically become the industry leader in lowering the cost of PV across the globe. And here we have one of the projects that we have developed in the last years in North America. This is the project in Springbok 2 in Kern County in California, right in the Mojave Desert, which is 181 megawatt, and the second of a 3-phase project that altogether is about 400 megawatt. Going next, a few highlights of who we are again. Our portfolio is about 7.5 gigawatt. We have over a gigawatt of portfolio as well in development for storage. we touch on the story later on in the presentation. Completed 700 plus megawatt of utility scale, and another 700 different stages of development, which would be finished by 2020. To 1.5 gigawatt of PPAs executed, and over $2.7 billion of capital raised since 2015. And here we have two key projects in our portfolio. One is the Monsignor cluster, 3 assets that altogether is 800 megawatt, one of the largest projects in the world. At the time, the largest when the PPAs were executed, as measured by the number of megawatt under PPA. And the second one was the Springbok 2 that we saw a picture before, which was the first project that in the U.S. were able to compete and beat the fossil fuel prices, and particularly in California. On the left, on the right side of the screen, you can have a sense about the key players in the industry in the U.S. Where we basically place on all over that. A little bit more on the kind of projects that we develop and the different clusters that we have right now in operations and the different technologies. Even though it's all single axis, we have different technologies, and you can see from different pictures, different colors, there are projects developed and operational using tenfold and silicon technology. A little bit of our key message, first and foremost, is we're totally independent. We have no affiliation with any IPP or international or technology provider. We're totally technology agnostic. We have only one view, which is to make solar abundant and consistently reduce the long-term prices of solar PV. And we only aim to be basically best in class in both LCOE and LCOS. Moving on to a little bit of our operations. So we started in California back in 2009, where we have been one of the most successful companies. A few years later, we initiated our expansions over the US, and still with significant focus in the Southwest. And right now, we have operations all across the country. And moving on into our international expansion, that was initiated in 2015. We have targeted 4 key countries. In Asia, we have India and Bangladesh, where we have secured some of our first PPAs. And in Latin America, we are very active both in Mexico and Brazil. Today, the subject of this conversation. Some of the lenders that we have worked with, I believe many of these names are recognizable for everyone in this presentation. And a little bit of our strategy. We focus on greenfield development, and we control the whole process of the development process, starting from the transmission analysis all the way down to O&M. And as we saw before, solar is very much a financial product, so we want to, and our aim is to control every step of the way to ensure that our product, in this case solar, is not only financeable but extremely competitive and attractive to different investors, and hence increasing the rate of success, which at the end of the day is the element that matters most, the attrition between projects that are successful versus the ones that are not successful. And finally, I will, before passing over to the baton to my colleague Eduardo, I will talk a little bit about storage. Storage is becoming paramount in many of the markets that we work. We believe that storage will become as well paramount in Brazil. And we have make a big push and effort into the storage technology, but in hybrid, where we go solar PV plus storage and storage alone, where the combination is making one of what we call the killer applications. So we've seen not only the US, in Asia, but as well through Latin America, that the combination of solar plus storage is going to be able to displace pretty much all thermal and gas technologies as we move into the 2020, into the second part of the 2020 years. And with that, just want to say thank you for the opportunity and pass the baton over to Eduardo.
Thank you so much for those insights, Pablo. So we're just going to jump straight into Eduardo's presentation before opening up for questions. So if we can get Eduardo's presentation up, we can begin there. Thank you so much, Pablo, and over to you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Pablo and Isabella. Well, hello everyone. My presentation is on the screen. I'm just beginning it from first slide. Hold on a second, please. So, well, my subject is going to be a review of the results we had in the last major PPA sale opportunity, which was late 2015. As I believe most of you know, our market did not have auctions last year, and are going to have 2 auctions this year on December 18th and December 22nd. Well, quickly talking about Energia Capital, we have a total of 22 projects that add to 624 megawatts into large clusters, one of 92 and another of 500. We expect to have both in the coming auction of December 18th. We also, when we compare, one interesting thing to see the auction results, both first auction and second auction. There is a lot of good public available information for interested parties to understand what the auction result was. And one of the information easily available is what is your capacity factor considering your nominal power plant capacity. From that information, we derived the peak capacity factor. And for people that are not used, if you want to get solar yield, you just have to multiply the capacity factor there's there by 8,760, and you do have the solar yield. But the relevant thing when you look at these lines now is to compare and to look at how big are the difference between top projects and even average projects. So when you look at second auction results, well, Sol do Sertão is our site, and it didn't sell power at that auction, but it would have a capacity factor of 26.33%, meaning from the installed capacity, peak capacity, the energy output is equivalent to 26.3% of a full dispatch of that capacity, of that 26% capacity. So this site compares to the best site that sold power in the auction, having 2.8% more power for installed capacity than the best site in the auction. But the most interesting thing, information is that this first one already has, let's say, 8% more power than just one project cluster and another isolated project. So meaning, when you go from the top contractor to the third, you already have 8% less power for installed capacity. That's, in my view, a surprising result, as the auctions are very competitive, and they naturally should target for the exploration of the best resource in the country, as you have few constraints to choose the location of your plant. Obviously, connection availability is always a constraint, but what I'm saying is that once you have connection capacity in a given region, there's not so much cost for you to pick the best region. So usually it should pay off to locate your project as best as possible. So just for those that don't know, this here's part of a Brazilian map with some of the states which are most relevant for solar power generation. And just to not make it confusing, I would just call your attention for BA, which is the state that has most of enrolled projects and most of the power sale, and RN, which has been showing up on this public information as the region that would have the second best resource, or the state that has the second best resource. When you look at, well, how the market is spread over those states, there is almost 6 gigawatts of projects under development in Bahia state. And when you look at that particular auction, just a little over half of it made the whole process up to the stage of ready to bid in a regulated auction. Other relevant states, Minas, you will see also Pernambuco and São Paulo, which have significant capacity due to state auctions that were either organized in case of executed in case of Pernambuco, and promised but never executed in case of São Paulo. So there was a development effort in the states that are not so strong on the resource quality because of that. But the relevant states for a standard federal auction tend to be Bahia, Minas, and Piauí. So on the chart we can see basically the same information, just in a graphic view, isn't it? So how many megawatts you had approved by EPE, that means ready to bid. And on the other chart, you see effectively where the PPAs were sold. So although Bahia was the top with almost 4.5 gigawatts of projects ready to bid in the auction day, by the end of, after the auction, it had about 20% of the whole auction, which was smaller than over 30% you had in Minas Gerais state. So comes the question, what is and why these strange things are happening? And then one of the things you have to look at is not only how much was sold, but how much was available to be sold in each state. And as you see, Bahia could have sold up to 600 megawatts, but ended up selling only 200. And same thing in RN, second place. And when you see optimal, the orange bar means I have about 1 gigawatt in the auction to be allocated. And if I look at the top projects from Bahia, I could easily allocate 600 there. From Rio Grande do Norte, I could allocate close to 500. And then I would have in the optimal allocation to have some few projects in the third state. That would make, I mean, projects producing highest possible power for the total amount of PPA sold in the auction. But the distribution, the effective distribution in the auction was quite different than that, as you can see on the blue bar. Here I quickly mention about, and then I will leave to your review later, exactly how I gathered the data, and I selected the data, and I organized it to get to those results. But basically, I'm using public information, third-party certified, so there's no, let's say, opinion on my side in any way. One big deficiency of the analysis then is that, as you can see in the results, Piauí state, POI, is an important state, but it didn't sell power in the second auction 2015, the one we are looking at. So that state was not considered in the analysis, although it's an important state. So when you look at on the tables, you can see on the public information available which are the top projects. On the sponsor, you see only a letter, And when the letter repeats itself, it's because you're talking about the same sponsor with different clusters. And one of the things you see is that Bahia State has very high capacity factor projects, and many of them fairly close one from the other. Same thing happens in Rio and RN, but the number of projects are much smaller because we have this cut for capacity factors that makes sense. When you go to Minas, the third state, you see much more significant spread on capacity factor when you look at the set of projects that makes 500 megawatts or more of accumulated power. So this is an information that tells, well, one of the things it could be telling you is that in that given state you have a variety conditions for resource and therefore for production. It also may tell you, but however, given that people tend to locate in the same region, the most productive region, the spread you see also may tell you that, well, different developers are getting different results. So it does tell you that the risk of consistency on, let's say, the results of the first developer or second are higher, different than Bahia. And that's even more intense on, for instance, Ceará State, which took a relevant part of the auction, about 16%, even though it has few exceptional projects that didn't sell. The black one is the project that sold, 29, well, much worse than projects in Bahia or other states. And it also has developers making projects a lot worse than the one that sold. So when you look at what is the solar yield, comparing one state for another, if you assume Ceará as 100%, you see that Minas Gerais, a megawatt invested in MG state, gives you at least 5.5% more power on average, and in RN would give you 15% more power, and in BA would give you 16 to 17% more power for the same investment. So the difference is very significant. That's one relevant point. Well, this analysis didn't consider PLE, as I mentioned earlier, so this is something that one should have in mind, that resource there is good. There are a number of projects there as well. In fact, I would consider PI the second best state in Brazil, not RN. In PI, you also see that it's a lot more consistent on solar yields than you see in RN. So, coming to the conclusions we can reach is that apparently there is inefficiency in project allocation and in project location. And given the amount of this difference, you cannot justify them just because of potential connection restrictions. Because one of the things we considered in the study was that you did have availability in these other states to be connected. So that should be explained, this whole market organization or result. And then, well, in my view, one of the reasons for this result is exactly that the market is not mature enough, and there is still a possibility to arbitrage selling PPAs of outstanding projects. And in my view, a demonstration of that is the result you have in the same day. In fact, separated just by, was immediately after the solar auction, we had a wind auction. And although wind resource is more variable, and therefore you should expect to have wind projects selling PPAs with, let's say, with a more significant difference of resource, the result you have is exactly the opposite. Meaning, so in solar, that you could have your whole capacity located in fewer places. 14 different places sold power, whereas in wind only 3 locations. And the number of states involved in the national wind auction were just 3 states, whereas solar had power sold in 8 states. And the Bahia, BA, is best state for both wind and solar. And following the economic rationale of that, almost 90% of total power in the wind auction was sold in that state, whereas only 18% of the power sold on solar contracts was sold from Bahia. The economic loss of that inefficiency in allocation has a present value of approximately $110 million, and I found interesting to show that just because, well, that would be money enough almost to build an independent high tension transmission infrastructure from the best location in South Bahia to the federal capital, saying that because often people consider that location inefficiencies come from absence of connection, but the inefficiency of that the market is allowing is so big that it could pay for a whole transmission infrastructure for solar. So, and you see on the results, so if you divided the pool of states, therefore locations, in first tier, second tier, and third tier, one interesting thing is that you would see that most of projects are sold on the third tier, and just 1/3 are sold on the second, and 1/3 are sold on the first tier. So this is all, and I'm available for questions. One finally remark about my background is that my business, Energia Capital, is focused on project development, but I also have a position on the board of a relevant distributed generation local player that is focused on selling small solar PV systems for individuals and small companies. So if you have any questions on that regard, I'm also available for that. So thank you very much for all. Bye-bye.
I'd just like to jump into some questions. As I said, the webinar will be available for download, and we'll be sending out the details of how to do this after we wrap up today. So I think with Pablo, I'd just like to ask you a question first, and then maybe Eduardo can jump in after as well. Brazil really saw a boom in the solar distributed generation market when the growth of utility scale was really slow, if not completely plateaued. And I just wanted to know, in your opinion, what do you think are the most valuable lessons that Brazilian developers and Brazilian solar players learn from those years of very high level of distributed generation growth in the solar industry?
Well, the first thing I would say is that it proves that solar developers are extremely resilient, and we always find a way around to keep our operations running. And I think it's a high testament of the solar developers and how they manage to switch or transition from one segment to another one. And it's not an easy one. Being a utility developer is all about financial, it's making a project financeable and getting the right share of capital. When you move into commercial, you need to transition into credit, customer credit. You need to think about different credit enhancements and different contractor structures. So I think, as I said, I think it speaks extremely highly about the industry. But I would even say that I found that many of the utility developers or traditional utility developers managed to stick around and to keep their developments and to continue doing what they're doing in preparation of what is coming up to be their auction, and expected in December, if I'm not mistaken, December 18th. And it proves that the development cycles are always very long. Developers need to be prepared for 4 or 5 years of development cycles and be ready for resilience and be there for long. I think the natural, if we look at what happened in many countries, the utilities is the core of the bulk of the capacity, and I don't see that different in Brazil over time. And what we see often is other segments, could be residential, that happens in the U.S., or the commercial, that has been certainly the case of Brazil and as well in other places, to basically fill the gaps. I still think that the utility market would be by far the largest in the long run in Brazil, and those who have managed to stick around, and if I may use the word survive, they would basically have big regards over the long run.
Okay, thank you, Pablo. Eduardo, would you like to jump in on that question regarding the valuable lessons from the DG market for utility scale development?
Well, sure. Pretty much as Pablo said, I do agree that there is a fairly well-marked division between those two markets, and often companies are not the same. They're specialists on DG or on utility scale projects. And the utility scale, when you look at PPA sold, is already a market much bigger than distributed generation. And there is maybe the intersection that we are going to see between these two markets may happen a little later on supply chain, given the significant demand. Well, utility scale projects do have incentives to buy locally, whereas distribution generation usually imports all its supplies. So thanks to acquisitions from projects that are being executed on the utility scale market, there is the local production chain is being built. Now we have some large modern factories that are currently supplying only utility scale projects, but in the near future will be available also for distributed generation projects, and will certainly enhance competitiveness of those systems and growth.
Okay, fantastic. Now, one of the comments from the audience is that the presentations focused a lot on utility scale solar, which is obviously very interesting for Brazil right now. But they really want to know what the market is like for distributed generation solar now in Brazil. Specifically, what kind of capital is available for small DG projects, and whether investors are really interested in funding these smaller projects, despite the smaller ticket size. So it'd be great to know what you think about the sort of financial landscape for distributed generation solar.
I'm going to have to admit that that's something that we don't do, and therefore I can only give you a high-level overview of what it could be, and possibly maybe I will let Eduardo to answer on that one. Eduardo, you're going to have to take the lead, man.
Okay. No problem, Paulo. Thank you. So we have accumulated, now is over 200, as Isabella mentioned earlier, but by the end of last year, the total DG market was 140 megawatts. So it's growing very fast and does have relevant size at this point, but it's still less than 10% of utility scale market. And it's very well, I mean, there are many companies in this space. So it means that, it's really uncommon to see significant portfolios with a given player, with a single player. And regarding funding, small companies in Brazil do have a lot of incentives that would allow them to finance cheaply and long term with basically with state-owned banks and directed funding that is tied to investments in renewables and that kind of thing. However, to be able to import only in certain regions of Northeast, which are very good regions for solar DG investment, you do have this long-term cheap funding that can allow small companies to import components. Because if you have a system that is produced locally, your total cost will be much higher, and then doesn't make much sense to have, cheap financing wouldn't help much. So, but small companies do, in the Northeast Brazil, they can have both. Low capex and good conditions on financing terms in reais. So if you're out of that region, for instance, DG business has grown a lot in Minas, which is mostly for DG business, mostly in Southeast Brazil. So the most of MG state does not have cheap capital even for small companies. Then capital is not much more expensive, and then there's a shorter, and then I'm talking about reais financing. And if you think of strong currency financing, this is certainly a possibility, but you have currency mismatch in your business because most of local companies would acquire power on DG schemes, paying reais and most often indexed to the distribution company's tariffs. So there is a challenge there for DG.
Okay, fantastic. Now, something that I'd really like to touch on, even though it's such a big topic, it'll be impossible to cover in the time we've got left. The power sector reforms that have been announced by the Brazilian government in the past weeks, sort of complete reshuffle of the whole sector, not just solar, not just renewables, but the whole power sector. What kind of impact can you see that having on Brazil's solar market? For example, with the tariff system reforms and the reduction in subsidies available for solar power projects. Pablo, if you'd like to start us off.
Sure. So I think here we have to base on the examples of other neighboring countries and how they worked out for them. And the reality is reforms, when properly placed, do help. Particularly do help because we have a fantastic technology, and that is only improving, and therefore we have a product that is becoming more and more competitive and more and more able to basically set the price and set the tone for the markets. The reforms normally comes with high expectations and often delivers high opportunities. The question is always to what degree that reform is imposed, to what degree that reform, and to what degree that reforms is imposed, B, how quickly they impose or is basically put in place. Normally, in the short run, nothing happens. I don't see anything happening in the utility scale over the next few years, and clearly nothing for the third auction, which is kind of the focus right now for many. If we look what happened in Mexico, actually the reform was a catalyst for growth, and the market went from pretty much 0 to 3 gigawatt, or what it would be by the end of next year. So that's a great sign. And the more that the market is open and properly values the different products, the more opportunities solar is going to bring, given the fact that either solar by itself or solar plus storage is the market setter in any other jurisdiction. So I think we should welcome proper pricing and more transparency, and all that it can only yield us better opportunities in the long run.
Fantastic. That's excellent news. And Eduardo, what's your take on this subject of the power sector reforms?
Okay. Well, the reforms are very broad and ambitious, and most of it is stated more on principles than on effective objective measures, meaning that further regulation will be laid down through the coming years, and that a more significant change will take many years. So one word of comfort for people that are thinking of investing is that all rules and regulations that are in place now, they are valid, they will continue to be valid, they will not change in the future. They may change in the future, but not change in the conditions of those that made business under the existing regulation. So I think we have a scenario where things are not going to change much between, let's say, now and 2019. After a period of some few years ahead, things may start to change. As today and even more few years ahead, solar tends to be more competitive than other sources in the utility scale market. The change tends to be very good for solar, as they will enhance competition between power source, and solar will be better positioned to win that competition a few years ahead. So I think it will be very positive. On this distribution generation, there are some more concerns because one of the changes that is very likely to happen is that a DG power system is not going to receive more credits for both power itself and the offset, because we have a DG business, which is basically when you produce a power from a solar system, for instance, you get kind of a credit that offsets both the power as part of your tariff and the user of the grid system, the distribution company grid system as well. So basically, 1 megawatt that you produce, you get 1 megawatt credit for the full tariff. And something that is certain to be changed in a few years ahead is that we are not going to receive the credit for the distribution network. And that means approximately a loss of 50% of your revenue for not from projects you invest today, but projects that you invest when new regulation is in place. There are compensations expected that should come together with that change. So there is promise that projects will have a higher recognition for their location impact, meaning they are close to the load, so they should have some benefits, and also they are close to the consumer as well on the power tension where they are connecting, and they should be compensated for that. And there is also an incentive that will last for about 10 years or 10 to 15 years. I don't remember exactly now. So these two components will together be more than the credit you get today for when you sell power, referred to the distribution grid. So this incentive, explicit incentive we have for renewables that will be paid in new projects, and the fact that you have received a better revenue due to your position compared to the load. And these two benefits be almost 50% of your revenue or more. The market is unsure about that, and the reason why for distribution the changes are a little more, they have a higher level of concern that investors that are looking at the utility market.
I think, if I may add something else, I think that one of the good things is the AB Solar and the Solar Association in Brazil is very strong, and I'm fairly confident that they would be not only very active but very adamant to get good results for the whole industry, either residential, commercial, industrial, or utility. And to that extent, I think we should be cautiously optimistic that any reform is going to be good reform for our industry.
Okay, fantastic. Yes, I mean, AB Solar is a force to be reckoned with in Brazil. It's fantastic. We mentioned a few times today energy storage, which is sort of really in its infancy, but growing in Brazil. So I'd like to know how you both think the introduction of energy storage into the Brazilian grid is going to impact the way that we consume and we sell solar energy. So specifically for PV, what is the market going to look like with more and more energy storage projects being integrated into the system?
Sure. So I think let's start saying that solar plus storage, and the storage is basically a revolution in the energy segment. And storage is basically following similar path that solar did and is doing, with significant reductions over the last year. So we've seen that since over the last 5 years, battery prices has declined 45%, and that trend is expected to continue. We combine that with solar, which is for today one of the lowest capex technologies in the world, if not the lowest. And we have a product that you can firm and shape. You can basically do peak shaving or load shifting, and altogether we're talking about 10 plus applications that the combination of the two technologies could provide. Currently, there's quite a few markets where solar plus storage is very active, and what Brazil could truly enjoy of is the fact that the experience that Australia, that the US, Germany, and others are basically going through and learning from could be very easily deployed into the RFPs. I would very, very surprised that the 2020 any RFP that has a view of 2025 would not be considered storage, either in the solicitation or the developers itself, because we're talking about increasing your system size. We're talking about increasing your volume of electricity using the same infrastructure. We're talking about providing a product that could be way more valuable to the utility. Now we're talking about the ability to deploy that energy at will, and based on the flexibility that the networks are really in need of. I think as the regulators realizes of the value that hybrid solutions can deploy, they will be basically pay more for the same product that we can offer right now. And not only will we pay more, they would have way more flexibility in the way they manage their interconnections. The same 30 megawatt system would deploy easily at 20% more by proper sizing of the storage facility alongside the PV or wind or any other facility. And then we don't need to think about fast response gas turbines or use of hydro in needs of other technologies. I think it's a total revolution, and just the value that it can provide, not only in the dollar per megawatt hour, but the flexibility. It will certainly change the landscape in the years to come, as we're really seeing right now. I would encourage the listeners to look at some of the recent announcements and the prices that solar plus storage are achieving in some jurisdictions, and they will probably be amazed of how efficient and how competitive is the technology just right now, let alone what it would be in 2020, 2025.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Pablo. Eduardo, would you like to give your insights on how you see energy storage impacting the solar market as a whole?
Well, I'm not a specialist on storage systems nor on their economic feasibility today, but I think I can give a word on the demand side. So I think our market has today a great opportunity for storage on its off-grid systems. And the north of the country, we have, maybe it doesn't reach a gigawatt, but it's a market of several hundred megawatts in just one auction for off-grid regions that happened early this year. We had the total auction was over 300 megawatts, just a single sale opportunity. And well, those markets are being supplied by diesel and oil, diesel systems basically. And even for existing contracts, you do have the possibility to bring, for instance, a solar power solution or even a storage solution to replace the power that is being generated by diesel systems. So you have a very high cost of opportunity that I believe would allow business opportunities for storage even at the current pricing. When you look at the bigger market, and then we are talking about longer term, Brazil systems, as most of systems, do have storage demand due to increased participation of wind and in the future solar. And in the case of Brazil in particular, the alternative you have today for constant to increase grid reliability is to invest in LNG thermal generation, which is very expensive as well. So our market do offer a relatively high cost for power reliability that will also benefit storage in the medium long-term future.
Actually,
fantastic.
We made a great point, is the LNG and the fact that many systems are basically balanced through gas. And I can tell you that right now, in some of the most competitive markets, it could be with very cheap gas, solar plus storage is almost there. We're talking about $30 on a CCGT versus 40-ish, 45 on a PV plus storage in a good location. In our case, low supply of gas is not an option in Brazil, and it could be in certain places, but the gas can only go one way, it's SAP. But our technology will only go one way, which is down. So it's just a matter of time that, by economics, let alone everything else, it would be a much better value proposition with or without interventions from the regulators, just driven by the need of cheaper solutions. So just to circle back, we truly believe that is the future, and that's the way we see that many of emerging economies are going to go for in the years to come.
Okay, fantastic. I think that leads us on really nicely to one of our audience questions. So one of our listeners would like to know what you think is the best energy storage technology available right now for PV projects.
Oh, this is a great question. And I don't know if our audience is and I don't want to claim myself to be an expert in storage, just enough to be dangerous. There are multiple technologies out there, but the reality is the lithium-ion is the one that everyone is following. The big projects that we have been deployed recently all are based on the lithium-ion technology, which honestly is not much different from what you have in your cell phone, but it's stacked in racks, which looks like a computer, or one of these CD players from the past. And you have thousands of them in a warehouse with all kind of software controlling. So I guess here we're going to see a situation where there would be multiple technologies out there with possibly no more than 2, 3 at the end of the day, making from pre-commercial to commercial. Lithium-ion, driven by the fact that the car industry is basically betting on that technology. I think we are aware of the Teslas or the Leafs or the cars is growing up the demand, and we're basically riding with them with all these gigafactories. Every time that we hear one of these car manufacturers coming out with a gigafactory, We just need to think ourselves that we're going to be enjoying all these benefits of scale and reducing production. And we may have a situation a number of years to come where, similar with the beta and BHAs, I'm sure our listeners remember that we have several options, but at the end of the day, it was the market adoption and the volume who make the difference. And right now, I wouldn't say it's the best, but right now is by far the most available technology is the lithium-ion.
Okay, fantastic. Now I'm afraid that we've only got time for one more very, very quick question. So I'd really like to take it back to this auction that's coming up in December. It's the first energy auction that Brazil's seen in a while that'll include solar. And I think our audience would really like to know what each of you think is the most important factor that we need to take into consideration when preparing bid in this upcoming energy auction.
Eduardo, do you want to start with this one?
Okay, well, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think it's project location. When you talk about, the things that the developer or investor can choose, can manage. Project location is certainly something that you do have power over, and make a wise choice there puts you in an advantage that is hard to be beaten by other factors you can manage.
I think I would add to what Eduardo mentioned, two other aspects. One is I think developers have learned that we have to be responsible. The last contract, so the PPA process told us that, I think taught a lesson to many that we have to be responsible and in our auctions. The second thing I would say is size does matter. Brazil is not it's a complex environment. I mean, every environment is complex, but I would say that Brazil is towards the upper end of that scale. And small projects will have a harder time to make the day of light. And the third thing is financing. You need to get your finance in place or have a very clear picture of your finance moving forward, because even though it's a 4-year period, which is one of the best things Brazil could offer, and pretty much any country could offer, time really goes fast. And the day after your auction is come out successfully, you truly need to think about how you connect this project financing off the ground, given all the realities of complexities of Brazil. So that would be my add-on on what is very clear message from Eduardo, which is the location radiation does make a difference and impact into your final success.
Thank you so much for those answers, Eduardo and Pablo. I'm afraid that that's all the questions that we've got time for today. Both Pablo and Eduardo will be speaking at BEREC, Brazil's International Renewable Energy Congress, which will be taking place from the 23rd to the 25th of October this year in Rio de Janeiro. You can register to attend on the BEREC website, which is www.bereccongress.com, and that's up on your screen right now. So I'd really like to say a final thank you to our speakers, Pablo Otten from 8-Minute Energy and Eduardo Serra of Energia Capital. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, too, for joining the webinar.
Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Bye. Thank you so much for listening, and looking forward to seeing you all in Rio. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.